Hide and Seek, a short story by Hope Palmer. Rotten eggs. That's what it smelled like. Rotten eggs, shit, and the vomit that had festered in a pool a few steps from the body. That's the one thing I'd always felt was left out of so many crime novels and movies. The shit. Or rather, the smell of the shit that had been sitting in the poor corpse's underwear for Christ knows how long. It's all right for those that die from horrible diseases in hospitals, in my opinion. They die with dignity more often than not. You see, many who die in hospitals have hardly any appetite in their last couple of days, so there's not much for them to leave behind in form of bowel movements. Murder victims almost always die with no dignity, and not just because they shit themselves after death. James often likes to converse with me about the body's different ways of decomposing depending on what they've been exposed to and how they died, particularly over our lunch in the office, as though he couldn't do it at any other time. It was something that I'd often found rather grim, not that I'd ever mentioned it to him. Between 45 to 50 years old, the victim at my feet had truly died with no dignity. She was laying all twisted around, one arm flung above her head and the other stuck underneath her body. Whoever had left her there in the country road she had been found in had little care for the way she was arranged. Her skin, which was discoloured to the point of looking almost marbled, was sagging from her skin, and her hair was coming loose from its scalp already. Her eyes were facing the starry sky, half closed and glassy. The arm that wasn't trapped underneath her back was missing its hand, and I strongly suspected that the concealed arm would be matching. Left in a place with insect exposure, the maggots are already working away on her, probably somewhere outside, garage, or shed perhaps. Detective James Wilson hummed under his breath as he bent down opposite me to look at the woman. Just another day for him. Any ID on her at all? He asked, turning his gaze to one of the local policemen who was shining his torch down on the body. Nothing we could find so far. Didn't want to move her around too much until you turned up, the police officer replied. His eyes were trained on her wrist, with its festering skin and exposed bone. James crouched down and then reached into his pocket, retrieving the faux fur gloves I bought him last Christmas, and slipping them on. He then reached out and placed a hand on the shoulder of the woman. Pushing a little, he lifted her slightly to examine the hidden arm, and my suspicions were confirmed. Another missing hand. James tusked and lowered the body back down. The hands had been cut off hastily and looked more like they had been sawn off as opposed to have been strategically chopped. She might have been alive when it had happened. The marks on her forearm looked like she had been strapped or held down by God knows what and God knows by whom, and had struggled against it. Dark red had settled beneath her nose and at the sides of her lips, and I felt an urge to wipe it away. I couldn't, of course, so I shoved my hands in my coat pocket, twisting my wedding ring around and around, to stop myself from reaching out. There was far too much vulnerability to this old lady, who had been tossed in the road like a dead badger. James often tells me that I become too attached to victims, that I should see them more as cases and less as people. It's much easier said than done. Strange, really, James begun. I snapped my head to look at him so fast my neck cracked. Apart from the removal of her hands, there are no other signs of torture. With a strange gentleness I hadn't seen before, James Wilson pushed back some of the woman's greying hair to reveal a bullet hole towards the back of the left side of her head. Perhaps he was also feeling sorrowful over the death of this woman, or perhaps he was just tired. "What do you mean?" I asked dumbly. The cold winter air was making my chest hurt, and looking down at the body was making me feel like I was going to be sick. Someone else had already vomited at the scene, perhaps the dog walker who found the body, or maybe one of the policemen that was currently patrolling the area, now on search for 2 missing hands. "What I mean," James went on with a touch of impatience, "is that if they were going to just cut off her hands to hide her identity, to get rid of her fingerprints, why not wait until after she was dead? And if they wanted to cause her pain, why shoot her in the head? Why not leave her to bleed out from her wounds? Maybe she was making too much noise. They didn't want to risk getting caught, I suggested. James gave a dissatisfied hum in response, which irked me a little, and I wanted to remind him that he had hired me to manage his reports and run to cafes for his coffee and corner shops for his cigars, and not to accompany him to crime scenes, but it didn't feel like the right time. Instead, I crouched back down in front of her, glancing over her clothes. There was a dark stain on the left arm of her top, which was some floaty blouse that was loose on the arms, and reminded me of what my mother used to wear in the summer when we holidayed in Italy. Without thinking, I reached out and plucked at the sleeve, pulling it back and gasping. "Hey now, what do you think you're—" James broke off, as his eyes caught onto what I was staring down at. Carved into the blistering skin were 5 words. "Come and find me, James."